Hi, just a quick reminder that this podcast has merch, a Patreon, a Fiverr gig, and some affiliated links. The links to everything that I just mentioned will be in the show notes. Alright, now enjoy the show. I have to give a content warning. In this episode, there's mention of murder, addiction, and suicide. So listener discretion is advised. I am sure that you have probably heard people say you can't take your money with you when you die. Well, the subject of this week's episode really took that to heart. And she did it while breaking the social norms and living the life that she wanted to live. And decades later, the life of a pop star would come to sometimes eerily echo that life. Hi, my name is Courtney Jewell, and you are listening to the 11th episode of the 5th season of History Shelf, a podcast about history that proves that sometimes fact is even more interesting than fiction. Welcome to Season 5 of History Shelf. This season is titled History, Taylor's version. That is because these 14 people that I will be covering this season all have one thing in common. The one thing they have in common is they all have been name-dropped in a Taylor Swift song. Now, don't stop listening if you are not a fellow Swiftie like me. This season is not going to be about Taylor Swift. You don't have to be a Swiftie to enjoy this season. You just have to be a history lover. So please, stay. What we are going to do is you and I are going to go on a little adventure that spans 2,404 years. Who I am going to cover this season are fearless leaders, people from the screen, poets straight from the Tortured Poets Department, and people who were just trying to find a place in this world. Some of these stories may be stories of happiness. They may be sad, beautiful, tragic. But long story short, I hope that you will be enchanted to get to know the stories of these historical figures all too well. So, are you ready for it? For this week, I am talking about Rebekah Harkness. Rebekah Semple West was born on April 17, 1915 in St. Louis, Missouri, United States. Rebekah's mother was Rebekah Cook Semple, and her father was Allen Tarwater West Sr. Rebekah had two siblings, and she was the baby of the family. She had an older brother named Allen Tarwater Jr. and an older sister named Anna Catherine. This story is going to be filled with wealth, and it comes in right at the start. Her father co-founded the investment banking firm G.H. Walker & Co. with George Herbert Walker. George was the grandfather of the future U.S. President George H.W. Bush, and the great-grandfather of the future U.S. President George W. Bush. And Rebekah's grandfather was the founder of St. Louis Union Trust Company. So, to call Rebekah middle class would not be accurate, despite what Taylor Swift says. Rebekah grew up in a mansion, and she went to expensive private schools. Alan and Rebekah were Rebekah's parents, but they were not the ones that raised her. They had a nanny to do that. They hired the nanny because she had worked in an insane asylum. Rebekah took up dancing and ice skating when she was young to lose weight. Her parents told her that she was getting pudgy. This is the second time a woman's weight has played a role in their life. If you remember back to the Clara Bow episodes, that came up in her life as well. Rebekah liked the ballet, and she studied with Victoria Kasser. She also enjoyed the piano. She went to the Rossman School and John Burroughs School in St. Louis, and she graduated from Formata School for Girls in Aiken, South Carolina in 1932. In school, she made friendships with some future influential figures like Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart. She affectionately called him Potsy. Now, no matter what time period you're looking at or what culture, there are social norms that everyone is expected to follow. There is usually extra pressure for women to follow their social norms, and Rebekah's world had its own set of rules. So, Rebekah was dealing with these social norms that every American woman in the 1930s had to deal with, but she was also dealing with the social norms that people with her financial status had to deal with. But with any culture, you are going to have people that break cultural norms. And that is what Rebekah and her friends did. Her and her female friends were called the Bitch Pack. The Bitch Pack liked to lace punch bowls with mineral oil. They did that at Rebekah's sister's debutante ball. And they performed stripteases on banquet tables at society events. Rebekah got tossed off an ocean liner for shouting obscenities, and she offended fellow passengers on a cruise ship because she was swimming in the nude. And there was one time that she threw plates at an orchestra. She wrote in her scrapbook when she was at the Formata School for Girls that she set out to do everything bad. Rebekah definitely had the upper class clutching their pearls, saying, "What a mess." Rebekah married Dixon Walsh Pierce on June 10th, 1939. I saw some articles referred to him as Charles, and I don't know if that was a nickname or if that was really his first name or what, so I'm just going to call him Dixon. She married him because she had nothing else to do. When she was married to Dixon, she worked at an advertising agency. Together, Rebekah, or Betty as her friends called her, and Dixon lived in New York City. They had 2 children. They had a son named Alan, born in 1940, and a daughter named Annabelle, born in 1944. Annabelle went by her middle name, Terry. Rebekah and Dixon divorced in 1946. Rebekah got custody of both of their children after the divorce. 2 little side notes. Alan would end up shooting and killing a man in a fight. He was charged with manslaughter and did 8 years in prison. And Terry would sadly give birth to a severely brain-damaged baby girl named Anna. Anna died at the age of 10. One summer day in 1947, Rebekah decided to take a bike ride along the main street in Watch Hill, Rhode Island. To Rebekah, the decision to take a simple bike ride may have not seemed like a decision that would change her life, but it did. It changed her life because during the bike ride, she caught the eye of William Harkness. William was a lawyer, a decorated World War II hero, and the heir to the Standard Oil money. It took the couple no time to fall in love. They were married on October 1st, 1947. They were married at 730 Park Avenue, William's apartment. Now, I told you that Rebekah was born into wealth, and she was, but her money was nothing compared to William's money. This was a whole new ballgame. She was now in the who's who of the 1%. She was born into the 1%, and she married into the 1% of the 1%. Marrying William gave her enough status that in December of 1956, she ended up in the pages of Vogue. Not only was this Rebekah's second marriage, but it was also William's. Together, Rebekah and William had a daughter named Edith Hale, born in 1948. Together, Rebekah and William picked out a Rhode Island home and called it Holiday House. Now, just because Rebekah was now surrounded by high society, that didn't mean that Rebekah calmed her wild ways down. The parties that Rebekah and William threw were outrageous and a little loud. She even filled her pool with Dom Perignon, which gives you an idea of the amount of money that she had. Another time, she filled her fish tank with scotch. At one party, she dressed as a waitress so she could eavesdrop on her guests. And that wasn't the only time that she disguised herself. She disguised herself as a maid so she could stalk the author J.D. Salinger in an attempt to get him to turn his short stories into a musical. Rebekah and William loved having their wild and loud parties every weekend, but her neighbors were not fans. She would also later in life have ballet dancers practice on her lawn, something else that her neighbors did not like. Which I understand to a certain extent, her neighbors having problems with the loud parties, but complaining about the dancers just feels like a Karen move. Rebekah also erected a giant blue geodesic dome on her lawn, and of course the Karens didn't like that, so a neighbor sued her for zoning violations. But Rebekah got her revenge by dyeing her neighbor's cat key lime green. Their cat, and not their dog, like Taylor Swift said. Let me make it very clear that this podcast does not condone dyeing anyone's pets. And speaking of pets, Rebekah had a pet raccoon. And perhaps having unusual pets was something that Rebekah and the surrealist artist Salvador Dali bonded over. Because if you remember back to the Salvador Dali episodes that I did earlier this season, Salvador had a pet ocelot, and we do know that somehow Rebekah and Salvador's paths crossed. And like I said in one of the Salvador Dali episodes, I am not sure if they ever played cards together, like Taylor Swift sings in The Last Great American Dynasty, but we do know that they knew each other. We know that Salvador designed a platinum and yellow gold starfish brooch with a pearl, diamonds, rubies, and emeralds. The brooch has a pair of butterflies that can be attached to the arms, and they are platinum and yellow gold as well, and are made with diamonds, sapphires, and emeralds. Back in 2023, the brooch sold for $982,800 at Christie's, New York. She also commissioned Salvador and other artists to paint stage sets for her ballet company. More on her ballet company later. I know that this episode doesn't have a narrative like most of History Shelf episodes have, but that is because there's not as much written about Rebekah as some of the History Shelf alumni, so I'm just putting little pieces together. Sometimes in my research, I hit a gold mine, like with Clara Bow. I was able to find most of her biography online for free, and I was able to find other sources about her too. But sometimes I only have a little bit to work with. So when I have a short episode, it's not because I don't find that person interesting or I was just being lazy. It's because I just don't have the sources. And I'm not going to make stuff up because this is a history podcast. Now, there was a biography written about Rebekah by Craig Unger. The book is titled Blue Blood, but it is no longer in print, which means getting a copy is going to be expensive. I can get a paperback copy on Amazon for as low as $233.59. Look, I like doing this podcast, but there is no way that I am going to spend that much money on one book. The only time that I spent that kind of money on a book was when I was in college, and even then, I don't think I ever spent that much on just one book. A little tip for all the college students listening: always buy your books used and online whenever possible. But anyway, back to Rebekah. The woman who would transfer huge sums of money from one bank to another just to confuse her accountant wasn't everyone's cup of tea. In fact, the press often went after Rebekah and her bitch pack friends, Judith Gamble and Jane Johnson, though the press called them the bitch squad. Calling her friends a squad. Does that remind you of a recent famous pop star? You know who didn't care about what the press wrote about Rebekah? William. Rebekah and William had a great marriage. In fact, it was the only one of Rebekah's marriages that went well. Together, the couple wrote a song entitled Giggling with My Feet. Rebekah was also into the hobby of sculpting. On August 12th, 1954, William was sitting for a sculpture Rebekah was working on while they were enjoying the summer day at their home holiday house. While William was sitting, he kneeled over and died from a heart attack. He was 54 years old. William died less than 2 months shy of their 7th wedding anniversary. When William died, his money, the Standard Oil money, all went to Rebekah. So, just how much money was that? Well, I had a hard time determining just how much that was. Some sources said $27 million, one said $30 million, a few said $50 million, and one said $75 million. What it was a lot of fucking money. Money that should have had her and generations after her living a nice, very comfortable life. Newspapers, decades following William's death, called Rebekah the richest woman in America. After William's death, Rebekah spent the money like her life depended on her spending every last penny William had. So, just what did she spend the money on? Well, she decided to expand Holiday House. After she was done, Holiday House had 8 kitchens, 21 bathrooms, and 42 rooms. I don't even know why one would need 8 kitchens and 21 bathrooms. This arrangement kept her from having to see her children on a regular basis. But she didn't just spend the money on Holiday House. She bought a mansion in Palisades, New York, a penthouse in Manhattan, and she took vacations in Galahad and Nassau. William's death did not slow Rebekah down. She married again. She married Benjamin Keene. He was a doctor that she married in 1961 and divorced in 1965. Benjamin would not be her last husband. She married another doctor in 1974 named Niels Laursen. He was 20 years younger than her. They divorced in 1977. Even though she married 2 times after William, she never took either of their last names. She kept the surname Harkness for the rest of her life. Rebekah didn't marry again after Niels, but that didn't mean that she didn't have other lovers. But more on that later. Real estate wasn't the only thing that Rebekah spent her money on. Rebekah spent a great deal of her fortune on ballet. She gave millions to the Robert Joffrey Company, now known as the Joffrey Ballet, and to the Jerome Robbins Ballet. She hosted a ballet workshop for 20 dancers from the Robert Joffrey Company. At the time, in 1962, the Robert Joffrey Company was not well known. She hosted the dancers at Holiday House. They spent summers practicing and experimenting with new ideas. Rebekah would give the dancers the weekends off and charge accounts to the shops in town. She once served them a cake that had $10 bills baked into it. If there was a dancer that needed dental work or wanted a nose job, Rebekah took care of the bill. There was one dancer that did not have their own suit, so she sent all of the male dancers to Saks and all of the female dancers to Bergdorf's for formal wear. She also bought the dancers an old farmhouse in Westerly to practice in. She called it the Harkness Center for the Arts. She helped discover and trained many acclaimed dancers, and she didn't care about their race, background, or body shape. This was revolutionary for the time. The dancers loved the way that Rebekah treated them. Ballerina Lone Isaacson said this about the experience, quote, "We were in heaven," end quote. Rebekah's children didn't see it that way. they felt that Rebekah loved the dancers more than she loved them. Rebekah was kind to the Robert Joffrey Company, but there was some fine print. The company had to perform ballets to scores that she had written. One of her works was Dreams of Glory. It was about a boy that dreamed of becoming John F. Kennedy. Just because a lot of the dancers seemed to love Rebekah, that didn't mean that they loved her work. The dancer Lawrence Rhodes said that performing in that ballet about the boy that dreamt of becoming John F. Kennedy was one of the few times that he was embarrassed to be in a ballet. Rebekah also wrote the experimental ballet titled Journey to Love. This was one of the first ballets to be written by an American woman. Other ballet companies did not want to perform Rebekah's works. Jerome Robbins and George Balanchine refused to choreograph her musical compositions. Ella Fitzgerald also refused to sing the pop songs Rebekah wrote, even though Rebekah offered Ella money to do so. There are some things money just can't buy. In 1962, Jerome Robbins' ballet USA was performed for the Kennedys under Rebekah's sponsorship. It was the first ballet to ever be danced at the White House. In 1964, her ballet Barcelona Suite was staged at the Kiel Auditorium in her hometown of St. Louis, Missouri. Her support for the Robert Joffrey Company did not last forever. She wanted the company to be renamed after her, and she wanted to have more control over it. Robert Joffrey refused to meet her demands. So not only did she pool her funding, but she also took most of his dancers to form her own ballet company, the Harkness Ballet. Rebekah poured her money into the dance studio, Harkness House. She said this about the studio, quote, "You see, money can buy anything," end quote. The studio was meant to mimic the grandeur of European ballet schools. It had a marble staircase, silk shades, and a crystal chandelier. Her reasoning for this was, quote, "I hope the beauty of Harkness House will persuade some of these people that ballet need not be dingy, and that by their patronage they are contributing to the splendid and glamorous," end quote. The Harkness Ballet had two touring companies, a youth ballet, which taught Patrick Swayze, and its own theater. In its day, the Harkness Ballet trained more professional dancers than any other company. She brought in top choreographers like Jerome Robbins and Brian McDonald to teach 16 and 17-year-olds. She gave the dancer Alvin Ailey his first commission, and as I said earlier, she hired Salvador Dali to design sets. In 1972, Rebekah bought an old theater near Lincoln Center and refurbished it on a grand scale. It was the first theater devoted exclusively to ballet. It had hand-carved Louis XIV chairs and a huge mural that featured the company's dancers as well as Rebekah in the nude. One critic denounced it as the worst mural ever made. The Harkness Theater opened in 1974, but by then, Rebekah was starting to have money problems. She had started to run out of money. She began to cut back, and she looked for public funding. She had to sell the theater at a huge loss, and the company ended in 1975. This is what the documentary An American Ballet Story said about the company, quote, "The dancers, choreographers, composers, and designers were pioneers and experimenters. Themes of sexual repression, homoerotic love, tribalism, and even the aftermath of rape were explored by some of the most famous choreographers of the time, all the work and much of the music was original, end quote. Before it disbanded, Rebekah had poured a lot of money into it. The money that she put into it would be over $104 million in today's money. I feel like we all probably know a Rebekah. We know a person that thinks that they can fix something if they throw enough money at it, or they can buy talent. Although she spent most of her money on ballet and a great deal of it on real estate and art, she also gave some to charity. She gave $2 million to the William Harkness Medical Research Building at the New York Hospital, and she also supported medical research on Parkinson's disease. Rebekah once explained to a reporter why she spent so much money. Quote, "All these sensible things I've tried to do have turned out to be a mess. So I decided, why not do what I want? I'll be so disgusted with myself when I'm 70 if I haven't done anything with my energy, talent, and money. I like to see money used. I don't think you should hoard it." End quote. Rebekah had 4 husbands in her life, all of which I have already told you about. But her husbands weren't the only lovers in her life. Bertrand Castelli, the co-producer of the musical Hair, said that he made love to Rebekah in her office. He said that Rebekah told him, quote, "Kiss me, the others just know how to bite," end quote. This is what Bertrand said about their tryst, quote, "It was as if we were 2 camels in the desert who suddenly know the only way to make an oasis is to really talk sense," end quote. After doing the horizontal tango with Rebekah, Bertrand was made artistic director of the Harkness Ballet. Rebekah was also in a relationship with the dancer Bobby Seavers. Bobby was a dancer that began his career in 1965 at Rebekah's school and ballet companies. Bobby was 25 years Rebekah's junior, and he was also a self-declared homosexual. Bobby loved Rebekah, but he wasn't a fan of her children. He said they were, quote, "the most worthless, selfish, useless creatures I've ever seen," end quote. He stayed with Rebekah until the day that she died. He even lived with her. Rebekah struggled with addiction. She became addicted to alcohol and injections of vitamin B, painkillers, and testosterone. Guests would find needles in her bathroom and blood splattered on the walls. Her voice grew husky and her muscles calcified. An acquaintance said that Rebekah walked like Frankenstein. Rebekah sought help in 1977. She checked herself into Silver Hill, a rehab clinic in New Canaan, Connecticut. When she got out, she sold her Palisades mansion. In November of that year was when Rebekah's son Alan went to prison in Florida because he killed a guy. Alan said that his time in prison was the happiest time in his life. Remember, I told you that Rebekah had a daughter named Terry. Terry had a daughter named Anna, and Anna was called Angel. Angel also died in 1977. For a time, Rebekah had been enamored with Angel, but that didn't last long. Rebekah didn't like it when Angel pulled a ribbon out of her hair. And I think maybe there was some discussion that Angel was going to live with Rebekah, or they were at least going to put a nursery in Rebekah's home. Because this is what Bobby Seavers said. Quote, "When they started talking about putting the nursery over my room, I just hit the ceiling. I don't want this screaming baby over my room. Let the little creature die." End quote. Rebekah had a rocky relationship with her children. Her youngest daughter, Edith, spent her life in and out of mental institutions. She started trying to kill herself at the age of 15. Edith flung herself out of a high-rise in front of Rebekah. An awning saved her life. She also swallowed pills, but still survived. Rebekah's response to her daughter's suicide attempts, well, I'll quote Rebekah herself, quote, "How should she do it? Is there a chic way to go?" End quote. Rebekah had a long battle with stomach cancer, and she lost that battle on June 17, 1982, in her home in Manhattan, New York. She was 67 years old. Rebekah had reconciled with her children before her death, though her son was not with her when she passed because he was in prison. Bobby Seavers was by her side when she died. Rebekah was cremated after a memorial was held at the family home. Rebekah had purchased a $250,000 jeweled rotating chalice called the Chalice of Life, designed by Salvador Dali. Rebekah once said, quote, "The pearly are not for me. My ashes are going into that chalice, and I'll pirouette forever." But things did not go the way Rebekah had planned. All of her ashes could not fit into the chalice. Her daughter Terry put the rest of her ashes in a plastic grocery bag. Somehow, hours after some of her ashes were put into the chalice, it became uncovered, and a witness said, quote, "Oh my God, she's escaped," end quote. Rebekah's final resting place is in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx on a shelf at the William L. Harkness Family Mausoleum along with William and his family. Rebekah and William's daughter Edith killed herself on August 22, 1982, just a little over 3 months after Rebekah died. She was 33 years old. Right after Rebekah died, her so-called friends descended upon her apartment at the Carlisle Hotel, taking everything of Rebekah's that they could. The only thing that Edith took was her mother's 40 pill bottles. Terry tried and failed to have Rebekah's will invalidated. Bobby Seavers said this about it, quote, "It was complete chaos. It was so wonderful. Everybody running around, signing wills, and trying on different wigs." End quote. Though, by the time that Rebekah had died, Rebekah had spent most of her fortune. So what happened to Holiday House? The Holiday House property was divided into 3 lots. The house was partially demolished, then sold to a family that remodeled it and renamed it High Watch. Then Holiday House sat quietly on that beach until 2013, when Taylor Swift bought the home for $17.75 million. Now, I say in the intro that this season is not about Taylor Swift, and it is not, but I do find the parallels of Rebekah and Taylor's life interesting. Taylor has had parties at Holiday House, and that has brought paparazzi, and that has made neighbors complain. When Taylor put up no trespassing signs, neighbors complained. And now that you have heard Rebekah's story, I have to ask you, does any of this sound familiar? Rebekah doesn't have as big a legacy as some of the people that I've covered on this podcast, but Lucky by Christina Perro is a novel both inspired by Taylor Swift's folklore and Rebekah's life. The documentary An American Ballet Story explores Rebekah's legacy and her company. And Taylor Swift's song The Last Great American Dynasty is about Rebekah's life. It is track 3 off of Taylor's 8th studio album, Folklore. And that was the life of Rebekah Harkness. Thank you so much for listening to the 11th episode of the 5th season of History Shelf. Next week's episode is going to be about Dylan Thomas. I hope you come back for that. A few things before we go. If you want to follow this podcast on social media, the TikTok is at History Shelf. The Instagram is at history_shelf_pod. The Twitter is at History Shelf Pod. And the Facebook page is History Shelf Podcast. If you want to help out this podcast financially, there are a few ways you can do that. One is you can buy merch from the History Shelf merch store, or you can become a Patreon. This podcast is always going to be free, but there are some perks that come along with becoming a Patreon. The first tier is called History Student, and that is $1 a month. And with that, I will give you a shout out on all social media platforms that History Shelf is on. I will also choose one Patreon at random for each episode I do, and at the end of the episode, I will give that Patreon a shout out. The second tier is called History Fan, and that is $3 a month. And with that, you get the first tier, plus you get to vote in a poll that helps me choose the theme for the next season of this podcast. The third tier is called History Buff, and that is $20 a month. And with that, you get the first 2 tiers, plus you'll get a handwritten note of thanks mail to you from me. And the last tier is called History Lover, and that is $40 a month. And with that, you get the first 3 tiers, plus you get to choose one item from the History Shelf merch store. You can choose any item that you want except for the Zippo putty. You can also take out ad space on this podcast. I have a gig on Fiverr that lets you do that. Also, if you click on one of the affiliated links and you buy something, that helps support the podcast. There's one for Riverside, one for Amazon, and one for Bookshop. But if you don't want any of the merch or any of the perks, and you don't want to buy anything, but you still want to help support the podcast, I turned on listener support on Spotify for podcasters. The links to everything that I just mentioned will be in the show notes. But as always, the best way that you can support this podcast is just to continue to listen to it. And there are a few other ways that you can help out for free. One is if you are listening on a platform that lets you rate this podcast 5 stars and or leave a positive review. If you do that, that would be very helpful. Also, sharing this podcast on social media with your friends and family would be very helpful. All right, well, until next time, keep learning, keep loving history, and come back for next week's episode. Bye.